Welcome to Living Once Twice, a lifestyle design and personal adventure podcast. My name is Justin. Come with me as I'm here to help you chart your course for creating the fulfilling life you desire. Join me as every Wednesday we'll dive into the inspiring guest stories, remarkable science, and useful strategies to help you create the momentum you need to take action towards designing your dream life. Remember, your dream life is waiting for you. It's time to go for it. You deserve it. Greetings all, and welcome to Living Once Twice. Thank you for tuning into today's episode. I am very excited to bring on today's guest, Shavaughn Baker. Shay is a strategic consultant, entrepreneur, ecosystem builder, founder and CEO of the Corporate Concierge Group, and also the host of a new podcast, the Shavaughn B Show, and so much more. Shay, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I am great, Justin. Thank you so much for inviting me on your show. I'm totally looking forward to this conversation.
Me as well, and I'm excited for our listeners. Now, just to give our listeners some context, I came to know Shay as she put together this amazing podcast collective group here in Oakland that I joined about a year and a half ago. And I'm telling y'all, she is a powerhouse. So I'm very, very excited that our worlds overlapped and that you put this group together because, as I mentioned, your group gave me that space and that confidence to really pursue this podcasting thing and thrive. So I thank you for that.
Thank you. I really appreciate you guys even entrusting in me to even create that space for you guys. You were able to find a space where you can, meet content creators and also feel inspired. So I'm grateful to have met all of you. So thank you.
Yeah. No. We'll talk about your special power of connecting people because you do it so well. So, Shay, you have a lot of insight, lessons to share with our listeners, especially regarding building a business from the ground up and developing an entrepreneurial mindset, as well as establishing a community to create momentum towards designing your dream life or designing and going after what goal that people have for themselves. But before we dive into that, let's talk about just who you are and your story. So can you just share with our listeners a little bit about yourself and your background, who you are, where you're from, and what you currently do for a living?
Okay. So originally I am born and raised in Oakland, California, and I never set out to be an entrepreneur. My goal essentially was to work in finance and basically just work my way up within that industry. I saw myself as essentially becoming an attorney and working as, either in criminal justice reform or working for a financial institution and kind of advising them as it relates to like regulatory guidelines and just keeping the organization compliant. Never made it to law school. Eventually got to a place in my career because it was in the finance industry. It's very traditional, very antiquated systems and processes, including systems. And with that being said, it's really hard for you to climb up the chain in terms of being promoted because number one, a lot of executives within the finance industry, have been in their positions for 30 plus years. They don't necessarily create new management positions. So it's kind of hard for you to move up. And I felt like I had put in at that time, like 10 years in the industry, and I had reached a glass ceiling. I wasn't moving up, but I was making lateral moves. And to me, that wasn't enough. And while I was making lateral moves, it just came with more responsibilities, but it didn't come with an increase in salary. So the harder I worked, the more I was rewarded in more work. And I felt like that just was unacceptable. So one day I ended up launching my own company, which was it was a service-based business that provided various different operational functions for mortgage banks and financial institutions in 2013. And the reason why I chose that company was because I was already working in the industry. I had working knowledge of how the industry worked, how we worked with third-party vendors. So I felt like it was an easy transition for me. Unfortunately, I could not have been wrong because obviously starting a business and understanding an industry is two very different things. And as I built my company, it was rather difficult because I went from working in this industry to living paycheck to paycheck to trying to figure out how to navigate building a business with little to no resources. So I had to do things from a very limited capacity. And I do recall one day stating, like, I just wish that there was a company where I can get the information that I needed, or at least a platform where I can get the information I needed, the training on how to build a very specific business in a very specific industry. And so that's where the Corporate Concierge Group was birthed. It was essentially just sharing information about my journey, the mistakes that I made, what I learned, and sharing that with people by way of a blog. And then I started to decided that I wanted to turn this into a business. So I ended up hosting free webinars, a lot of ebooks, and e-courses, just teaching people various different aspects of the business building, the business development stages, which is essentially how to get started. That was like my main focus, is let me teach people and share information on how to get started. So I started learning a lot about different industries, meaning if I wanted to start a catering company, how would I go about getting started? So I learned as much as I needed to about that specific industry, and then essentially created an ebook. It was like 100 something pages, but it literally detailed how you would start a catering company. My next book was how to start up a real estate company. And my next book was how to start a virtual assistant company. So with that said, so for about a year and a half, that's the services that we had provided. And one day I had woken up in August of 2018, and I was like, entrepreneurs need more than just an ebook. I mean, there's just certain things that you cannot find in a book because building a business is just too complex to put it in one book. So I felt like we needed an ecosystem that would connect entrepreneurs to like mentors, to capital, to different training programs, because someone actually mentioned this the other day, which is like generational knowledge and how information is passed down. And with that information, you can use it as a tool to apply it to various different aspects of your life. And so that's why it was important for me to create different growth and training programs, because knowledge is such a valuable tool. I mean, it's so empowering. And so I just began to build an ecosystem as opposed to building a company. And most people, they're probably like, how do you get paid doing that? Or, that it doesn't seem as sustainable. But for me, it was like the vision is essentially creating this ecosystem and or the framework for this ecosystem to be able to be built in any metropolitan city, so that marginalized communities can be able to build sustainable economies. And so I wanted to start that here in the Bay Area and eventually branch off elsewhere. So that's the mission that I'm on right now, is building that ecosystem that will be able to sustain local economies, especially from marginalized communities. So that's my journey.
And that's a remarkable journey. And there's so much within that I want to unpack. But let's just talk about the ecosystem piece for everyone. What's your definition of an ecosystem and what does it consist of? You definitely talked about how it would be for marginalized communities and supporting them. But in terms of your vision, like, what does it consist of when you think of this ecosystem you're putting together?
Honestly, where that idea comes from is we live in the Bay Area. It's one of the highest concentrations of startups in the world, and everyone's trying to replicate it. They're literally trying to rebuild what we have here, and the ecosystem here functions in a way like a well-oiled machine. And there's equal contributors, organizations, local government agencies, community leaders that ensures that this ecosystem works effectively. And what that looks like is entrepreneurs come here to get started. They come here to start their businesses. So what they do is they'll come here either to enroll in an incubator program, for example. An incubator program essentially helps you to ideate your business idea, essentially, meaning it's a place where you can go to cultivate that idea to essentially develop it into a viable business. And then from there, you're able to come out of that program with a viable business. And then from there, if you want to grow your business because you have customers and you're at that place where it's time for growth, you'll enroll into an accelerator program. And so that accelerator program will help you grow and scale your company while also connecting you to resources such as mentorship, to training programs, to capital, which is all essential to being able to grow your business. And then you have local government agencies that incentivizes companies for starting businesses within their cities. So with that being said, is you have an entire system that is cultivating these entrepreneurs. And with that being said, is again, it functions like a well-oiled machine. And this is why, specifically in the Bay Area, why we have that high concentration of startups here is because, if you make it here, you make it. There's an entire system here built to ensure that you make it. So with that being said, is I felt like we needed something that was very specific to our needs. Marginalized communities are essentially underserved, and having access to, even though we technically live in the same area where these startup companies are, access to those resources are not necessarily being distributed into marginalized communities. So instead of sitting back and waiting for someone to come into the area and say like, hey, here's how we can help, it's my thing was, let's build it. So let me connect with the big players that are already contributing to this large ecosystem to come help build this one over here.
And I love, this concept that you're talking about, this ecosystem, this, in a way, this equitable, supportive pipeline, and also how you're, just being clear and honest that like, we know that this doesn't exist for marginalized groups. So in your story, you talked about how essentially your struggles and the gaps that you've seen out there almost fed a lot of your purpose. So, going back to that, as you were, starting to develop this vision and work yourself towards it and work towards it, what was that period like for you? Like, what prevented you from giving up on that goal? Because you didn't have an ecosystem or the supportive pipeline. Like, once again, you self-taught and you had to, kind of go through the bumps in the road, and you're now helping others to hopefully avoid those same scenarios. So during that time where you were kind of in the grind of it all, what kept you motivated to not go back to, say, the 9 to 5 life in which you were saying, you would get promoted, quote unquote, but it would just be more responsibilities? Like, what kept you grounded to continue going forward?
Well, I grew up in Oakland, and I grew up in the late 80s and early 90s, and I watched communities being devastated by the disinvestment of businesses to drugs, violence. And for me, growing up and seeing that, how politicians can overlook an area not just for a couple months, 2 years, but for decades, and then decide that because we want to create opportunities for businesses to come to our city, we're now going to invest in certain neighborhoods. Now we're going to develop them. Now that everyone who has left, will now come in and develop these areas to make them safer, to make them livable. As I started to see Oakland, California go through various different stages of development, I felt like it was such an insult to the community leaders and then also the residents that lived in those areas, who were consistently always going to town hall meetings and trying to rally the community, while also trying to stop the violence within our communities. So they work on overtime to save our community. And for me, I never forgot that. I never forgot that there was always like this social movement to change what was happening around us. And that vision always stuck in my mind. So then when I became an entrepreneur and I started my own business and was looking for different resources in Oakland, and I saw that there was a concentration on what kind of businesses what kind of businesses had certain levels of support, and what kind of businesses the city was willing to invest in, and provide resources. That also furthered my it fueled me to want to offer something that was, again, specific to our community. I mean, our needs are vastly different than a lot of people, so to speak. And so that was like the start of why it was important for me to build this ecosystem, is to stake claim in what, some of the people who generations who were living in Oakland had built, but then also to create a place where Oakland is known for supporting Black businesses at the end of the day, Black entrepreneurs and founders. So that's one of the reasons why it was important to build an ecosystem for them.
Hitting on another thing that you talked about too in your journey was, I heard you talk about like you were learning how to create a business from scratch and you encountered issues like you were saying, living paycheck to paycheck and dealing with that. So once again, how did you overcome kind of your learning curve? And what advice would you give to listeners out there facing that same challenge who are thinking like, man, maybe I don't have the blueprint to create this business or understand contracts and are feeling kind of like a little stuck or even fearful in going in that direction? Like, what from your experience would you share with them as advice to, if they feel like they lack something or they lack a skill set or a knowledge of something, if they feel like they can't move forward still in the direction of their dreams?
I would say that for a lot of us, there is no blueprint. And that's how I felt. Once I realized that like there is no blueprint in what it is that I'm building here. So stop looking for it and to really hone in on that, my vision, my skill set, my life experiences, and to build from there. There isn't always a textbook answer to what it is that you're building. Sometimes you just really have to go with your gut at the end of the day. And people will be surprised as to how valuable your background, your skill set is on your entrepreneurial journey. For me, I've lived a life of having to be resilient, to persevere, because of how I grew up. Essentially was like an independent kid growing up. I had to be independent as a kid. So like as kids in my neighborhood were, just essentially living their lives as children, like I was basically forced to be an adult at a very, very young age. So for just me personally, I learned to be independent and seek what it was that I needed on my own. So that's essentially what has helped me today, or even just get started with my business, and it keeps me going. Or that just basically just perseverance, is, I believe, is something that has been very instrumental in me continuing to build my business or to build this ecosystem. So I would just tell people to just hone in and really focus on what your skill set is, what your talent is, because that's your most valuable asset. And honestly, that is what will be your answer to the questions that you're seeking in terms of building a business or even getting started.
Yeah, and I appreciate you talking about just that factor of like grit and perseverance because the process isn't straight and it's going to have peaks and it's going to have valleys. So when it came to just your mindset alone, like how did you I guess prime yourself to be ready for those peaks and those valley moments, or even moments when you realize like because you didn't have a blueprint. I know you talked about sometimes you may have in the earlier stages priced your value a little bit lower than
Hmm.
you should have. So how
Yeah.
did you once again start to develop your mindset to be an entrepreneur and even those times of when you would have a setback to continue to just persevere and to push yourself through?
So my first company, which was my service-based company, I had originally priced my service packages very low because I felt like if I'm affordable, then I can attract more clients. And then I realized one day, having worked with the client after offering my quote unquote affordable services, that I was really doing myself a disservice. Like the amount of work that we put in alone to meet our service level agreements, coupled with the number of years I put in to even learn my business, to even get to this point where I've launched it, further should have let me know like I'm well deserving of whatever amount of money that I require. You know what I mean? So it took me after working with one of my clients that I realized like, wait a minute, I need to change my mindset in order to receive something greater. I need to change my mindset to believe that I'm worthy of being compensated for my time. Because at the end of the day, like I know what I'm putting out. So therefore, I deserve in return whatever it is that I ask for. Another thing that I learned along the way is as I decided to pivot with the corporate concierge group and decided to build this ecosystem, there was a lot of pushback, like from friends and family, because they felt like, you're not going to make any money. But my whole thing was like, the money is going to come eventually. Like, building an ecosystem, it's not just about me. It's about a community. And I just believed that in my vision so much to the point where I just had to block out the noise and just to keep working, keep putting my head down and not share a lot of information in terms of what it was that I was working on so that I can remain focused. Because there's no point in you talking to someone who doesn't believe in what it is that you're doing. So that was a very hard lesson for me to learn too, is to really surround myself with like-minded individuals, people who actually believed in what it was that I was doing. Because at the end of the day, those might be the people that I needed to collaborate with anyways to build this organization. And that's exactly what I did, because some of the comments were extremely discouraging to the point where it did make me question what it was that I was doing. But once I learned to just block out that noise, I was able to concentrate and focus and just keep going.
And I appreciate you sharing that because for some of our listeners out there, yeah, maybe you are going and sharing kind of this dream that you have, this goal, this aspiration that you have with those who are closer to you. That could be family, that could be friends. So for you to share that maybe you weren't getting the supportive feedback or push that might resonate with the listeners, and you talked about how you had to block that out and maybe seek community outside of that. Were there other affirmations that you were saying to yourself? Because sometimes you can't help but internalize when when you hear family and friends share those things where you're like, maybe they're right. Were there affirmations or things that you continue to say to yourself to once again, you know, help almost block out the negative kind of inputs that were coming in?
Yeah. So I believe in God. Like I'm a Christian at the end of the day. And one of the things that I learned, in the teachings of the Bible is manifestation and faith. And for me, I would really meditate on scriptures in relation to faith, and also manifestation of what it was that I was praying for, which is, clarity and to be strategically connected to individuals, but then also just trusting in the vision that, was given to me. So for me, that's essentially is what really has kept me going, kept me grounded, is my faith at the end of the day.
I hear you. I mean, the whole part about visualizing it and seeing it out there is so important because the power of our minds, it's really impressive. And then, everything that we see around us started with an idea. So someone believed in an idea enough that it now became a reality. And once again, you've been creating so many different things. But what's important or impressive about what you've been creating, you've also been so intentional and thoughtful too about putting spotlight on companies that are at the beginning stages of their building journey. And so why has that kind of phase for a business been so important and resonated for you in terms of the spotlight you put at them when they're in the early stages? Not necessarily when they're at the peak, but when they're in that kind of growth period.
I think the beginning stages of a business is probably one of the most pivotal stages for various different reasons. But it's essentially the place where you build that strong foundation, and you need so many moving parts to help you do that. And it was also important for me to highlight what Black entrepreneurs are doing here in the Bay Area so that people can know who to support and more importantly to learn about what's happening out here. And of course, the podcast that I have is not specifically for founders who are in the Bay Area, but I really want to start with introducing these new players that are coming up in the ecosystem because I just think that what they're building is incredible. I love hearing their stories, and I think everybody else should hear their stories and learn about what their process is like for building a company and to share perspectives and insights that we don't normally hear from so-called thought leaders and experts. Just learning how to build in a completely different way sometimes that's outside of the traditional business advice. So that's why that was like a key component. And then also to essentially build that relationship with these founders to be able to, again, help them along the way with their journey as well, too. So
Now, when you're working with founders at that beginning stage, are there any common pitfalls you observe or mistakes that you once again see many in the early stages make that for a listener out there they should just kind of be aware of that hey, this is something that you might want to just be prepared for possibly encountering?
yes, one in particular is building the framework for various different processes and systems very early on in the business development stages. And what I mean by that is a lot of times founders will just focus on other key aspects of the business, but forget about processes and systems and will essentially cross that bridge when they get there. I feel like if you build that framework up front in terms of the process for how you acquire a customer to how you cultivate and nurture that relationship, that will enable you to be able to see like the various different, it'll help you to see like what your process is like overall, the customer life cycle all the way up until like if customers drop off to how your sales team is handling customers. And you can obviously make iterations as you go along, but having that process up front alleviates somewhat of that pressure of having to build it later on, or even having someone come in and build it after the fact. Another thing that I noticed that a lot of founders make the mistake on is um, when they're at the stage of hiring, they typically will hire the individual and will say like, hey, listen, we are a startup and we expect for you to be quote unquote scrappy, which means that essentially the new hire has to figure out the company, the processes, figure out various different systems. To me, I feel like that takes entirely too long for the employee to become fully acclimated within their role, which means that kind of slows down what they need to do in their role overall, which kind of puts everybody, it's almost like a domino effect because you're waiting for this person to catch up at the pace that everyone else is at, but you didn't prepare them correctly at the very beginning. So having standard operating procedures to even developing a training program, I think helps position founders much better when hiring new talent when they eventually get to that point.
Oh, that's some golden advice and some golden nuggets that you shared there, Shay, about once again people putting together as they're putting together their own blueprint, thinking through some of these different pieces and components that are so valuable and so vital to their success long term. So you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier about community. I always like to ask this. So for you, once again, like where did you go to find that community that might have been missing? And, once again, what's been the importance of community in your journey?
I feel like, well, first and foremost, like in my previous roles, I was a loan officer, and relationship building was a key aspect in developing my business as a loan officer. The finance institutions that I worked for did not provide us with any leads whatsoever. So we had to go out and build those relationships with real estate partners and referral sources, which obviously that's time consuming. But because we're in a relationship building business, so to speak, or whatever, it's essential that you have those strong connections in order to succeed. So I carried that experience into my entrepreneurial journey because I felt like community helps entrepreneurs in various different ways. You're able to feel seen, represented. Um, you can share your struggles as a Black entrepreneur because, again, I believe that our entrepreneurial experiences are vastly different than other entrepreneurs. And also, it was important to build a sense of community so that we can get back to collectively collaborating with one another and building businesses, not just necessarily competing in, the same space, but also contributing equally within our community to ensure that we're building um, a thriving economy. So it was important for me to meet with the entrepreneur community, get to know, again, who's doing what their need is, and to build relationships from there with the entrepreneurial community, which is what I did in 2017. I launched a entrepreneur support group in Oakland. We would meet once a month, and that was just to basically like to share best practices, to just learn more about the entrepreneurial community, understand what their needs are, so that we could connect them to the resources that they need. And that's where it all started in terms of building community, and it hasn't stopped
Mm.
since.
And Shay, you did touch on this, and I want to kind of dive a little deeper into you being a Black African American woman in terms of what you encountered that along your journey and along your path, that which once again would be unique for you, but if you were, say, a white male, would be a lot different. What was that experience like as well in your entrepreneurial journey, and anything that you would share with other Black African American women who are out there who are once again, pursuing this space, and any advice that you would share on that?
Yeah, you're always going to be like underestimated in terms of like the amount of knowledge that you have from your to confidence, your confidence level, to your product and or services that you're offering. The advice that I have for Black women is to it's very important for you to hone in on the value of your product, the value of your service, but more importantly, your skill set that will enable you to not just execute that idea, but to build that business in a way that you see it. And even if others don't believe in you, or if you do get pushback, like from venture capitalists, I would just keep going and to find a way to get what it is that you need to get done. Because at the end of the day, there will be some resistance, and there'll be some days where you feel like you'll start questioning what it is that you're doing. Um, but at the end of the day, you have to know that what you're building is valuable, and that you deserve to be in any space, regardless of what. So that's my advice.
I appreciate you sharing that. You once again have been proven that, and having that confidence in yourself to once again continue in spite of whatever the outside world may think or say. You've continued to just build and create, and once again, collaborate and bring people together. And I would definitely say that's a superpower of yours. One of your many is your ability to connect people and opportunities to each other. So,
Thank you.
uh, so as we get to wrap things up here, I have our each one teach one rapid fire questions. So these are just a couple questions, and feel pretty much free to say the first thing that comes to your mind. So, are you ready to rock and roll here?
Yes. Go
All
ahead.
right. So, the first question is, what book has changed your life?
As cliche as it sounds, I'm gonna say the Bible. Like honest, I mean, that's just again, that has a lot to do with my faith. Like I don't read a lot of business books, so to speak, or whatever, but that has changed me because there were some personal things that were happening in my life where I needed internally to be somewhere. I'm sorry, how should I say this? Mentally, spiritually, and emotionally, I had to really align myself with what it was that I wanted to do before I could actually show up and become an entrepreneur. So, like I literally had to position myself in a way that I would align with the people and resources that I needed, but I needed to get into that mental space to do so. So for me, that has been very instrumental in shaping who I am today.
Can't argue with that one. Cannot argue with that one. So, we're going to time travel here. So, if your 20-year-old self was to meet you today, what would she be most proud of about you now?
I think like just in spite of everything that I've been through, that I was able to persevere. I think like because it didn't look like I would even get to this point at some point in my life. So just to be here and just really just standing in my truth, living unapologetically me, I think she'd be proud of that.
Excellent there. And because you are, once again, you make 48 hours out of a 24-hour day, what do you do when your battery gets low and you need to refill your own self-care cup?
I this might sound extremely selfish, but I felt like that at the start, right before the pandemic had hit, like in February actually, where I was just like, I'm being pulled in too many different places. I'm surrounded by individuals in which, I felt like I needed to make changes in terms of changing my circle to, I was just feeling emotionally drained. So for me, I was going to take the month of March off in a sense where I'm cutting everybody off and everything off and just going to focus 100% on me. And that very moment, obviously that the pandemic had happened, I realized that I needed to incorporate that into my self-care routine as it relates to, just consistently just shutting people and things off to the point where I can just have a moment to myself, and just to recharge because I'm always surrounded by people. My phone rings like crazy. I have tons of emails. I think that that could be draining at sometimes. And then you also have to keep in mind like people's energy is transferable. So you're also taking on people's energy as well too sometimes. So I definitely need to like be mindful and taking a break from that. So what I do is I do anything from in Oakland we have this beautiful Lake Merritt. I might walk around Lake Merritt, or I might just go for a drive. It's very simple what it is that I do in terms of like shutting down to recharge, but that's essentially what helps me on certain days.
No, good for you, especially with that reconnecting with nature. I totally hear you on that. So our last question that I'm asking all of the guests this season is: if you had all the resources on the planet, Shay, time, money, people power, what would be your passion project? What would you bring to life in the world?
Oh, I would do a lot of things.
Such as.
I would definitely have a lot more green spaces and sanctuaries, as well as community gardens in every single major metropolitan area, specifically where Black and Brown residents live, specifically for the reason of enabling them to have access to a place where they can, again, have access to a sanctuary, to having access to fresh produce and fruits. And I would also open my own a space that's it's kind of like a pantry, but at the same time, it's like a community center where people can come in, learn how to cook healthy meals, but then people can actually also come in and have access to a pantry in the event that they need food, groceries. They could just come in, and the place will be called My Pantry, My Kitchen. You can come in, get food to eat. You can come in and learn how to cook healthy meals. And then we would have like a community garden at the top that helps to supply some of the fresh produce. What else would I do? I would definitely create a re-entry program where folks can essentially learn various different technology-driven type of programs to help them enter into the tech field or to launch their own businesses.
Because of your DNA, I wouldn't surprise if you brought all of that to life. So we'll all just stay tuned and watch it unfold here. So, Shay, as we wrap things up, what's next for you? Where can the listeners find you, learn more about you, check out your podcast?
Okay, so my podcast is Shavaughn B, the Shavaughn B Podcast. You can find that. It should be like on all major platforms. I know for a fact it's on Anchor. What's next for the Corporate Concierge Group? So we are currently working on working with a tech partner at the moment to develop a program that essentially will help machine learning and artificial intelligence led startups to build their prototypes, to develop their MVPs for those that have existing MVPs, with the goal of essentially helping these businesses to get started or to develop their business ideas. So that's what we're working on right now.
Excellent. Well, Shay, once again, just want to thank you for taking the time to join the show and to share your insight and all of the amazing advice with the listeners. Listeners, I just want to say, if you did not just listen to this amazing interview and leave inspired, Shay has lived it from the ground up, from building her vision and her business and all of her different ideas and doing it without a roadmap. And, once again, staying true to herself and being grounded in her vision and never stopping, even with any of the roadblocks along the way, continuing to persevere and finding it in her spirit to not only, create this and design this dream life for herself, but now she's out there helping others to get connected, developing this amazing ecosystem, support system so that others, especially from marginalized groups, can thrive. I mean, it's just amazing what she's doing. And so I appreciate you. I know our listeners out there appreciate you. And I definitely hope everyone continues to look out for the amazing projects and work and checks out your podcast. So thank you so much for your time. As we wrap it up, I guess I'll just kind of close out by saying thank you all for out there for listening. And thank you for checking into this episode, which I hope you enjoyed. Reaching out to you all through the time and the space that separates us. I'd just like to say thank you for your presence and tuning into today's show. And remember, your dream life is waiting for you. Go for it. You deserve it. Catch you later on Living Once Twice.